In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
Cultural fit is one of those elements that, without a doubt, we made some early mistakes on in the first few years of going about growing our business. Without a doubt, we've progressed to understanding that things should be looked at as a cultural contribution as opposed to a cultural fit. I think the huge risk with thinking about things from a cultural fit perspective is that we just go about hiring the same type of people that we see ourselves in. I think it's interesting that people with the training and education that we've tried to do around how dangerous hiring for cultural fit can be, it's that unconscious bias can really easily creep into people's decision-making processes, even if they're not aware of that. So the reality is the educating ourselves and reading as much as we can in relation to unconscious bias and educating our leaders that are hiring has got to be one of the first steps that we've got to do. Values, of course, with the people you're hiring have to be shared, but personalities and backgrounds and approaches absolutely do not. I think it's pretty dangerous if you get to being a bit of a mono-thought business where everyone thinks and acts and comes from the same type of background. So I think, hiring for cultural fit is a very tricky way of doing things. And I think cultural contribution is certainly where we've tried to take our own business in recent months.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 64 of the Culture Lab podcast. So before I introduce my guest today, I have a question. Does your company have a culture playbook? Do you know how to create one? If you are not entirely sure what I'm talking about, no worries. I created a free guide that explains everything. In 20 minutes and 3 simple steps, you'll kickstart the process of growing with purpose and cultivating a culture that helps you thrive. You can download your guide by typing this into your browser, bit.ly/culture playbook. It's all lowercase, one word, bit.ly/culture playbook. Okay, and now it's time for today's episode. Recently, my focus has been on companies that continue to grow. And especially these days during the pandemic, it's not that easy. And I wanted to understand and to share with you what their secret is and also what role culture played in their success. So today my guest is Peter Rabey, the CEO and co-founder of the X4 Group, which is an award-winning multi-brand recruitment business. And Peter's company employs currently 150 people. They are mostly in the UK, but also in the United States and New Zealand. It has just hit over £37 million in revenue last year, and it's a business that grew organically since 2008 without any outside funding. And I wanted to speak to Pete because he really managed to scale and grow his business through extremely challenging times. Since the coronavirus pandemic, his business has realigned its strategy to keep as many people in work as possible. And as a result, they not only managed to keep everyone, but they actually grew their headcount by over 50% since June. So tune into this conversation about growing during a pandemic, rebooting your business to survive and to thrive in a new environment, hiring, onboarding, building and cultivating a healthy culture, and much more. Without further ado, here is Peter Rabey. Peter, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thanks, Ago. Good to be with you today.
Really good to have you. I'm excited about this conversation because I know that you have a lot of interesting stuff to share with me. But before we jump in, I want to ask you first to tell me and our listeners a little bit about you and about what you do.
So I'm the recently appointed CEO and co-founder of X4 Group. We are an international group of recruitment brands across both the UK, the United States, and New Zealand. We've grown from 3 of us to over 150 people over the last 9 years, and we had over 37 million in sales in the year just gone.
And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are curious about the journey of growth. And what helped you, what stood in the way, what were the challenges. So I'm definitely going to come back to that. But before we go there, there's one question that I ask all of my guests, and it's about your background and your childhood. And what I'm particularly interested about is your early cultural influences. What do you think shaped you as a person when it comes to culture?
I think the key thing when I look back and think about culture as an experience over the last kind of 20 or so working years that I've had, it's the amount of variety that I've been able to experience and learn from during that time. Both my parents are in the public sector. One was in teaching, one was in the police service. And even from sectors that are very, very different to a business environment, it was very palpable and obvious what a positive and engaged and energized workforce felt like compared to places maybe that didn't have that kind of culture. So I think, be it from pushing shopping trolleys as a 16-year-old or working in bars and restaurants, I think what's very, very obvious is that it's incredibly clear when an environment does have a positive culture or one that doesn't.
Right. And, this makes me curious because you are one of the co-founders of the company that you are the leader of. So I'm curious, where do you think that entrepreneurial streak comes from?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think our own professional working experience came from a very large privately owned business that then turned into one of the FTSE top 250 businesses in the UK. That was our training ground at S3. We know that they came from a bit of a startup culture, that a lot of the people that had become very successful had started with them as trainees on day one. And I think when you've gone through that kind of environment and seen the kind of success that a lot of people have had in a very fast growing business, I think it naturally creates the kind of mindset of thinking, wow, that must have been some journey to go on. And I wonder if I've got the capability to be able to do the same myself.
Yeah, totally. I think it was Napoleon Hill who said that you are an average of the 5 people that you spend most time with. And I think when you are immersed in an environment or when you're surrounded by people who are engaged in some sort of activities, whatever it is, it kind of rubs off on you for sure. So you mentioned the growth that you've experienced as a company over the past 8 years, was it?
Yeah, over the last 9 years, we started hiring in 2011.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm really curious about that. And particularly, I guess, I'm curious about what you've learned about scaling through the pandemic. And I think it would be interested to get your perspective as the CEO of the company that you lead, but also what you are learning from your clients, because you mentioned you work with a variety of industries and also various sizes and types of companies. So I know that you are really a well of wisdom and knowledge on that topic. So please share with us.
That's it. I mean, we placed with over 1,000 different groups and organisations as a business last year. So lockdown, although thrust upon us in a fairly dramatic and at points a relatively scary way, I think was a really interesting time to take a step back and have almost a bit of a blank piece of paper mindset of what do we like about the business, what do we don't like, and what changes do we want to make so we don't just survive during this kind of crisis, but we thrive off the other side of it. And I think one of the really interesting things has been that the Microsoft Teams and the Zooms of this world were such a mainstay of daily activity for so long. I think it allowed a lot of CEOs, founders, HR professionals, and CTOs and people that were going through growth themselves to, I don't know, for the first time have a properly collaborative approach, a bit of a we're all in this together type of ethos. And I think the kind of engagement that we saw from all varieties of professionals and businesses during lockdown and immediately after has really allowed people to think about scaling and thinking about that we face challenges altogether in a completely different light to that we may have done before lockdown. So I think that's an incredibly good thing that has come off the back of something which has been, so tragic for so many people. In terms of ourselves, we've grown by over 50% since lockdown, which is an incredible head count to both bring into the business, but also plan for, because I think hiring itself can be looked at as its own entity, but the reality is I think of kind of hiring as almost the top 10% of the iceberg. What you see above the surface is the hiring part and the onboarding part, but the 90% beneath the surface is what you've got to do before you have to even think about scaling or thinking about hiring, really planning out where this fits into the overall business purpose and vision. Is it reactionary or is it part of a longer-term vision? Have the right people been consulted and been engaged with it? And do you actually have an infrastructure and a learning and development team to be able to onboard the numbers that you're looking at to do so your new staff are going to be getting the same experience and the same level of kind of support that they're going to need to be able to be successful? So I think in terms of kind of scaling a business through a pandemic, the communication is obviously absolutely vital. I think it's fantastic to be able to share with as many people as you can ideas about onboarding, ideas about hiring remotely as well, because the reality is there are some things that I think have really surprised some of our clients during the last few months of hiring. I think a few were of the mindset that, this is going to be quite easy to hire because there's lots of businesses, unfortunately, shedding staff at the moment. We'll be able to pick up the best talent. But in the sectors that we sit within the technology, life sciences and communication space. Actually, the speed of process, great talent is still going off the market incredibly quickly. We're seeing some incredible results in September, especially of how a lot of businesses are really ramping up their hiring, and therefore people having a succinct and culturally empowered process to make sure that they're getting the best people through is still as important as ever.
There's so much that I want to unpack here. And I think the first thing that makes me feel curious about is that blank page that you mentioned, and the fact that because of the pandemic, you and a lot of your clients decided to look at your business with new eyes, I guess. And as you said, ask yourselves, what do we love about our business? What sort of things do we want to keep? And potentially, what do we want to change? So I'm curious, what came up for you when you did this exercise for your company? What did you learn about what you loved about your business, but also maybe of the things that you didn't like? And what did you change as a result?
I think one thing that I know that the three of us who founded our business were incredibly conscious about is how many mistakes we'd made in the last few years certainly outweighed the things that we loved about the business. Don't get me wrong. I think it had been a really positive time for so much of what we've done. But when we looked at things, even like our hiring process, what we thought about that and how we'd maybe made the mistakes of creating the wrong type of culture in our business over a few years, that was a huge lesson. Where we'd put our energy and efforts and the type of individuals that we were taking with us on the journey, these were all things that we had to look at and decide, are we happy with how things have gone? Are things in the right place? Or actually, no, there are a few things here that we should start again on and really think, what have we learned in this? What did we not like about it? And really try to do things in a better thing off the back of lockdown. And so far, thankfully, from having such a blank mindset approach, and that certainly comes from a cultural perspective as well. Business overall is important, but when you're thinking about recreating something and doing things in a better light, I think it's really, really important to get to be as honest and as candid as yourself and as you can be. And I think from a cultural perspective as well, we're recently starting to engage with sending out employee surveys to ask the question of what our own staff think of our culture as it stands and seeing what answers that throw up. I know that all of these answers won't be wholly positive. I'm sure there'll be some things to take from that, but I think it's a bit of an emergency stop like the lockdown period was back at the end of March is a really, really great chance to think, right, what do we like and what we don't like and what actions do we actually want to take off the back of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's incredible because very often, especially for high growth companies, that moment of reflection usually comes with a crisis. And it's either an internal crisis or, like this one, something that we definitely couldn't foresee, or at least an average person maybe was not aware that we might have a pandemic imminently. But I'm curious, why do you think, being a founder, being a CEO, why does it take a crisis sometimes for us as leaders to look at our businesses with a critical eye? And
Yeah.
why do we struggle so much, to be proactive when it comes to those things?
I think it's an excellent point. And I think it's something that when you are, and I refer to it a lot in our own business, when you're in the mud every day, going into the office or doing whatever and engaging and just kind of dealing with, some days it's firefighting, other days it's getting on with some strategic pieces. But the reality is, when you're enclosing something, it's very hard to take a step back and look at what do
Yeah.
we like and what we don't like. And I think one of the things that lockdown showed for us is that we're going to try and plan into our quarterly strategy an off-site time each and every quarter with some individuals where we can look at things with a bit more of a blank canvas and say, right, what have we liked about things and what have we not liked? I think every business that can learn from these events that transpire, and I agree with you, why does it take a big global, catastrophic event for people to do that? I think the reality is it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and week-to-week and month-to-month running of your particular business, but taking a step back can have enormously positive benefits off the back of it we're already seeing.
Yeah, it's this whole idea of getting onto the balcony. That I don't know who exactly created that metaphor. It's pretty old. But someone said, when you are dancing on the dance floor, you are so focused on not stepping on other people's toes and how the other dancers are moving that it can be very hard to figure out what would be the best way to move across the dance floor. And so sometimes we need to get on the balcony and look at the dance floor from a distance to be able to see the bigger picture. And I think crisis situations very often create that necessity to just step out and have that 30,000 feet sort of look at our business. Okay, so you've decided to make some changes. You said that you've noticed that a lot of your clients have gone through the same process. And I'm wondering, when you think about the companies that have been particularly successful during these difficult times, what contributes to that? Is it their strategy? Is it their culture? Is it simply pure luck because they are in an industry that has been growing exponentially and has been even accelerated and strengthened by this crisis? Because definitely there are industries that have been in a way, ironically, supported by what has been going on. So, what are your conclusions?
I definitely think, of course, there has to be a little bit of luck involved with the marketplace that you sit in. But I think the reality is we know that we've benefited enormously by being a very small organisation at the moment. The ability to be able to react to events that are unfolding around you. I don't think anyone's ever been in as good a position as they are in relation to the amount of data that's available to be able to make educated decisions off the back of it as well. But also then strong leadership to be able to make some calls that sometimes aren't very pleasant. I know within our own business, we were in 5 different industries and we've taken that down to 3 off the back of a lot of information that we learned at during that time. And some of those conversations and decisions that you've got to make are pretty tough. It's also very, very clear as well, I'm sure, to a lot of leaders that there are some people that aren't going to be right for the next part of your journey and that might have been very integral to operations before that. So without a doubt, I think leadership often comes with some tough decisions. But once you made those decisions, every effort and every ounce of your effort being going into making sure that the decisions that you've made are getting the relevant energy required off the back of it.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also curious about what you've mentioned around hiring people specifically, because obviously this is an area that you are very, very, very familiar with. And I know that it's one of the big concerns, particularly of high growth companies. How do we do it well? How do we take the right decisions that we don't regret 2 or 3 months down the line? So what is your advice, and how do you think companies should go about finding the right people for their business?
I think the first question, a little bit like I alluded to earlier on, is to ask where this particular hiring is going to fit into the overall vision. Is the vision something which is still where the business wants to go? And trying to look at things, as you say, not just in a reactionary sense, but looking at things at a strategic sense. Where do these people fit into our overall hiring plan and business plan overall? Do we have the setup to be able to support them as we need to when they come on board with us? Are we fully prepared for remote onboarding if that's necessary? Are we fully on board for a process that, even looking at things like an interview process, have we looked at our interview process in the last 6 months, 12 months or beyond that, or have we done the same thing for a little while? I definitely know that we were guilty, despite being a recruitment company ourselves. We did our own hiring in a certain way for a very long time. And what we're now trying to do is make sure that we've got particular circuit breakers in the year to reflect continually on what is best for the current for the current times.
What is your take on hiring for culture fit? It's a very popular term recently. It has been a popular term for a while. And I think people have various reactions to it. So some are absolutely on board and they think that we should be hiring people for culture fit. Some are completely against it. So I wonder, where do you stand on this?
I think cultural fit is one of those elements that, without a doubt, we made some early mistakes on in the first few years of going about growing our business. Without a doubt, we've progressed to understanding that things should be looked at as a cultural contribution as opposed to a cultural fit. I think the huge risk with thinking about things from a cultural fit perspective is that we just go about hiring the same type of people that we see ourselves in. I think it's interesting that people with the training and education that we've tried to do around how dangerous hiring for cultural fit can be, it's that unconscious bias can really easily creep into people's decision-making processes, even if they're not aware of that. So the reality is, the educating ourselves and reading as much as we can in relation to unconscious bias and educating our leaders that are hiring has got to be one of the first steps that we've got to do. Values, of course, with the people you're hiring have to be shared, but personalities and backgrounds and approaches absolutely do not. I think it's pretty dangerous if you get to being a bit of a mono-thought business where everyone thinks and acts and comes from the same type of background. So I think, hiring for cultural fit is a very tricky way of doing things. And I think cultural contribution is certainly where we've tried to take our own business in recent months.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. I think that cultural fit has been an excuse for many teams and many companies to hire, the little me's basically. And it's interesting to me to hear from you that you feel like companies should be hiring for values and cultural contribution. Before you mentioned being clear on your vision and on your mission. So what I'm hearing from you is basically, if you want to be successful with your hiring, you need to have a lot of clarity around who you are and what you stand for. And so I want to give us an estimate of the market, really, because you are doing work with so many companies. When you look particularly at startups in growth stage, do they have this clarity that they need to find the right people? So do they know exactly what their mission is, what their vision is, and what values they stand for, and how to look for people who will be the right fit?
I think, Aga, there are some people that have got an absolute clear vision for their business from day one. And I think there are some that have a vision for what it could look like. And the further they go along the journey, they realize that actually that may be needed to be, or not changed, but kind of reshaped and relooked at. And I think the reality is, as long as people are engaged with their important stakeholders in their business, engage with them in relation to what are we now, what do we want to become, but also and open with their communication and share what vision that they have for the business at all times. That's where I think it could kind of be the right balance for all within the business.
Mm-hmm. So basically, there's no clear trend. It depends on the company, is what you're saying, right? Some are more
I
clear.
think
Some,
so, because there are some very established markets. There are some businesses out there that
yeah.
that are trying to be disruptors, and therefore I think it can really depend, dependent on the type of business and market they're in.
Totally. Some practical advice from you, Peter, about how you can minimize unconscious bias. You've referred to that, and we all know it's a very important topic, especially recently. There has been a lot of conversation around this. But unconscious bias, by definition, is unconscious, and so it can be very tricky to really try to minimize it. Probably impossible to eliminate it. So, what advice do you have for our listeners to A, be aware of it, and B, how can you prevent unconscious bias from messing up with your hiring process?
I agree with your statement. Completely agree in relation to, I think it is virtually impossible to entirely remove it from a process, because at the end of the day, especially with hiring, people tend to buy from people. If you've got a person in front of you that comes from a similar place, seems to have a similar personality, naturally, we, as human beings, as you say, it's not a conscious thing. You kind of will naturally gravitate towards that type of person. But I think the biggest thing before any hiring process is that the key people and stakeholders within the process are retrained, are re-educated, and made re-aware really of what unconscious bias looks like. And also, before businesses start to hire, actually putting a bit of a metrics and point system in place of what you want to cover during your process. We saw, when we sat back and reflected on it, that our process was pretty much 3 or 4 one-on-one interviews that are very, very similar interviews with 4 different people, and then they got hired at the end of it. And what we've tried to really do now is come up with a process that has some variety, allows different people from different walks of life to shine in different type of environments, but also really allows some flexibility in the role, thus appealing to people from lots of different situations. I think it's all about diversifying your recruitment process. So, a couple of examples of that is making sure that you get not just the same type of person in the different stages of the process. You get people that have come from different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different perspectives on things, because I think that always allows for a much more enlightened conversation, a much more enlightened process. I think exclusive language really exists as well, kind of especially in our sector and in the sales sector in general, speaking about being a winner, speaking about being relentless. This kind of exclusive language is definitely going to not make a large proportion of society be very keen to be applying for such a business. And also, I think broadening your candidate search. Do you absolutely need someone with a degree, or do you not? I think a really interesting thing that we're going to be looking at is getting into schools and colleges and enlightening people that, especially roles in sales, you don't need to have got a great degree from a very expensive university. If you're a great communicator, if you've got the ability to be a self-starter and all these kind of things, you can still have a very, very good life and very good career, even if you don't come from the type of background that some are fortunate to do so. And also, I think in relation to, I think there's lots of businesses out there also that are very, very reliant on employee referrals, maybe over-reliant. Although they can be quite a cost-effective way of doing things, they can absolutely add a risk of unconscious bias, because you don't know what that particular business is run like as well. And I think, like all these things, one of the other important things is when you sit down. We had a similar experience some 3-4 years ago. We were at a 75-25 male to female ratio in our business, and we realised that was way over what we wanted it to be. We want an environment that encourages a broad and diverse workforce, and so we actually set out some diversity targets with HR and with our internal talent acquisition team, monitoring weekly application and acceptance numbers, where we were getting people from, because without monitoring the data and without knowing where your current standpoint is, you aren't really going to be able to improve something without knowing where at least your starting point is. So I think that's a really important thing as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like this conversation about monitoring your data. And I'm really curious how many companies are doing this consciously right now. Probably large corporations, yes, but I'm really curious whether smaller companies have been paying attention to what's going on, and why do people who apply, and how could they have a wider pool? That's quite interesting. So what have you learned through your data? Can you share with us a couple of insights that you've learned as you were looking at the data when it comes to your candidates in your company?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that we saw from data is actually is the demographics of where people came from. We typically have always advertised, as I'm sure a lot of businesses will, advertised on the main typical job boards. And what we wanted to do was actually engage with our employees that came from diverse backgrounds, and engage with, let's have a conversation about where people go to find jobs from all manner of societies and backgrounds. And that brought up some really interesting results where we've now started thinking about a college and school related approach in relation to our hiring. This wasn't something that we would have done a year ago, because we've always managed to hire, and we thought we were doing it okay, but we managed to kind of hire via the main source of job boards. But actually, that's meant that first of all, the way that we were hiring meant that we weren't attracting, of course, as many women to the business that we've now managed to hire, which has been great. And I think a really interesting next challenge that we're going on is making sure that in a wonderfully a wonderful mixed society like London is, to make sure that we're getting people from diverse backgrounds that are applying to positions, and that isn't going to come from our traditional advertising models, and really having to be creative and looking at things again with a bit of a blank page of, we'd like to make a difference and make sure that our numbers can be better than the national average. We as a business have got an 86% white background, for example, at the moment, and we know that only 14%, whilst it is the national average in the UK, we know that for London we've actually got a bit of work to do in relation to that. So we're currently looking at ways that we can make sure that we get out to sources other than job boards, to make sure that we're hiring different people for our business that way.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks for sharing that. I'm sure that is going to be useful in terms of ideas for our listeners as well. So let's say that you've just hired someone, and now you need to onboard them. And I know for a lot of companies that have been hiring many people in the past few months, onboarding has been a real challenge, because a lot of onboarding has been happening remotely. And companies have never faced that challenge before, so they had no idea how to do it. And it's not easy, as you know, not just to onboard someone, but also to have them understand and experience the company culture and be able to figure out how we do things around here. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, onboarding is definitely something that's been thrust upon many businesses this year, Aga, for the first time, where they simply, as you say, haven't had to worry about that before. Normally when people start, it's a case of getting the team together for a cup of coffee and going through your week and bumping into people and arranging lunches and this kind of thing. But although we've been fortunate to be able to get back into the office, I know that lots of people aren't that fortunate. So I think it all comes, it's a people-led approach. That ultimately is the most important thing. Let me go through some points that I know that we stick to as a business. I think one of the things that when you've had an offer accepted by a particular candidate is making sure that a business is in regular contact, and multi people are in regular contact with them before their day one. Really using it as an opportunity to give some company prep and some time, but also making sure that there are HR and professionals out there to be asking about how anxious they're feeling before their day one, making sure that they feel supported, but also, as I mentioned about the people buy from people, is that it's not just one person from HR that's their sole point of contact before they start on day one. their line manager will want to be involved, an HR person will want to be, an L&D and support person, and a director from a business as well. It's a really nice idea. I don't think really you can have too much support and outreach, even if it's just a little LinkedIn message or whatever the case may be, of making sure they feel supported from multiple avenues. I think, of course, it goes without saying, but planning well in advance is crucial for a smooth onboarding process. Is the tech set up? Do they actually have a Wi-Fi strength from home that they're able to work with confidently, or is that something that they might be a bit embarrassed to mention, that they haven't got a particularly good setup at home, whatever the case may be? Really kind of planning well in advance is crucial for a smooth onboard process, and really making sure that first day and first week, they don't feel at any point, what am I meant to be doing now? That it's agreed with all parties. This is what the plan is. Do you feel okay with that? Do you know who to reach out to if you're not feeling sure about something? And really making sure that that there's as much support as possible. I'm sure a lot of listeners will be appreciative as well of technology and collaborative tools such as Slack, which is a great thing, really kind of acting as a bit of a virtual office where you can do instant chat and all those kind of things, which can help to build culture remotely. And I think almost having a bit of an agreement of what's a business-related collaborative tool such as Slack, but also more kind of social tools like Whereby is something that I've heard quite a few significant size businesses using, an alternative to Zoom. I don't know about you, Aga, but I was certainly getting pretty fed up with Zoom by the end of lockdown, despite the fact that it was an essential communication piece with all of our staff. But the reality is, Whereby is a nice little tool. You can kind of create, virtual bars and virtual cafes and these kind of things for people. No downloads, no logins for guests, but things where you can kind of turn up and just have a bit of a break, have a bit of a chit chat with someone random who might be in there for any given bit of time. So I think having the business side covered, having the social side covered, and of course, I'm sure everyone that's listening has either been invited to or taken part in a virtual quiz or virtual drinks, or we did a kind of couple of virtual cook-along classes that was pretty entertaining at times. But just trying to mix up how you can go about the social aspect and how you can do things so people really kind of feel part of your culture from day one.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think variety is extremely important. And I also know that there's a lot that we can learn from companies that have always been operating remotely. So, for example, companies like GitLab, and what is coming out of how they are working. And I think that they've been getting a lot of attention these days because everyone's trying to figure out how have they been doing this for the past 10 years or whatever, is that they definitely have a lot of documentation so people can really access information easily. There is a company playbook. So basically everything that you need to know is universally available to everyone and also to people outside of the company as well. And one of the things that they do that I love is that when they hire someone, they give them a list of, I think, 10 people that they need to meet in their first month, or is it a couple of weeks? I don't remember exactly the time frame. But what that does is that, first of all, people know that they should expect a meeting request from the new hire, and also the new hire feels comfortable approaching people because they know that they are on their list, and it kind of creates a process and a pathway for them to get to know people. And by the way, these meetings that they organize are just coffee meetings. So it's not about briefing the person about their job or whatever. It's just getting to know people. Which I think is really brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah, I really like that, Aga. I think these are the 10 people that are going to contact you in the next couple of weeks, especially for businesses that are fully 100% remote still, is a really nice way of doing things and allows different personality types to meet. I also kind of want to quote a previous guest of yours, Aaron Dignan, as well, who mentioned something really interesting about a culture brochure that companies can create. I think one of the things that we do during our onboarding in our first week is making sure that, that it's that there are multiple elements to any business that people might want to be a part of or try out for the first time. That if you don't have some kind of communication, PDF, or a bit of an introduction to the business. We have things like book club. We offer a diversity and inclusion society. We have women and men's kind of sports teams that exist. There's basically multiple elements to any company that, unless there's a clear way that that's communicated in the first few days, it's very easy for these very positive things to be lost in businesses. So I think that kind of culture brochure idea, especially in the more of a virtual world, is a really excellent idea too.
Totally. And Aaron has a slightly, I think he uses the term organizational canvas. I use the term company playbook, which is basically, everything that you need to learn about the company and its culture should be documented somewhere and should be available for someone to read. So I'm completely 100% on board and in agreement with you around that. I think it's really important that there is one source of truth in the company, and people can just go and learn about things. And also, those things like, what's our mission, what's our vision, what are our values, and how do they translate into daily behaviors, what's expected of you. I also love, and it was one of the things that Nikki Gattenby talked about, one of our previous guests as well, really letting people know from day one, what does it look like to be a brilliant colleague, right? So what do you expect from people? What sort of behaviors? So all of that stuff, I think it's really, really important to have it written down, documented, and communicated well, so that people don't need to figure it out. Because if they have to figure it out, it's going to be distorted. It's going to take them 1 year to learn about all that stuff. So it's a fantastic shortcut, whatever you want to call it. Culture brochure, company playbook, whatever name you give it, just get it done, would be my advice.
That's it. And one of the other things that I think hopefully a lot of businesses have done as well now is having a platform for company communication to be as much of a door open policy as possible. We've done something the last few months called our Future Forum, where on a monthly basis via Zoom or face to face in our kind of big event space that we've got in our London office, people can hear about the goings on in the company, but also myself and the other founders hang around for an hour afterwards to make sure that if anyone's got some questions or ideas that they either like, dislike, or ideas to bring to the party, that there's a monthly event specifically made up so people can come forward with these ideas. Because Nikki Gattenby is a really interesting individual, and I really like how it's very much a people first and ideas culture. And I think any business that can harness that kind of open door communication, I think is going to be in a much, much better position moving forwards now and after COVID.
Yes, agreed. Absolutely. I cannot not ask you this question because I know that our listeners would never forgive me. You're a great source of information on that. I'm really curious, what changes have you noticed in the criteria that not the employers, but the potential employees, so the candidates set for a potential employer? So what are people looking for, and what sort of questions are they asking you that they hadn't asked in the past?
I think the first one, especially because we do our hiring for the most part with people that have never been in a full-time role before, kind of embarking on their very first job in the working world. The question we get asked a fair few times is my job under threat with the potential of a second lockdown? What happens in the guise of a second lockdown? And again, thankfully, we had a couple of people that had started with us just before lockdown hit, and we were able to do a really good kind of remote training period for those guys, and we've got a really great template now off the back of that. But a lot of people ask, is my job under threat with a second lockdown? It's kind of good to be as candid and honest about it. I think the vast majority of people want genuine honesty and candidness when it comes to answers. No one's trying to pretend at the moment that the world's in a marvelous and fantastic place, and that with uncertainty becomes a lack of confidence, really. So I think honesty and candidness is important, but also people, of course, are asking the natural questions in relation to flexibility and remote working opportunities post-pandemic. Now that lots of people have experienced life remote, we've been really interested to see that a very high percentage of our business really like being in an office environment, like the engagement and the communication that comes from an office environment. But there's certainly a lot of individuals as well that know that them having a future happy work-life balance and being able to do some days from home, some days in the office is certainly the type of areas that people are asking questions about now that they never did before.
Yeah. Do you think that candidates care about company culture?
Absolutely. I think it's been really encouraging. I think it's one of the nicest things with our hiring across the summer period is that people, make the point of saying in final interviews, I haven't actually been able to see the office, of course. How would you describe company culture and what's been the progression with that? And I think people care about it enormously. In sales and recruitment industries, where quite often the achievements that someone's going to do, could be fairly similar in multiple different organisations. The reality is that people want to find a place that they feel some synergy that they can relate to, and that is part of them as an individual as well, and shares their values. So I would say, in a slightly strange way with a lot of remote working, I'd say that culture is probably more important than ever because people want a sense of belonging now, maybe more so than they did before.
This is a really interesting point. Because I think we over the past few months, a lot of people have actually been quite lonely. And so I can absolutely see why that sense of belonging would be even more important these days. Something to think about when you are a leader or an employer generally. How can you provide that to people, and how can you highlight the importance of that? Excellent. And so finally, last question that I have for you, Peter, in this section of the interview is, how do you perceive the future of work? What, in your view, is going to change? What are the trends that you are noticing? How are things going to evolve?
I think work fundamentally is going to have to continue to adapt as society dictates at the moment. The regulations from country to country are very different. I really think that businesses that have got through the last 9 months and managing to do so over the next 6 months should be very, very confident of succeeding in the future, albeit that how that work will look like is going to be quite different to how things were in a post-COVID world. I think the reality is looking at and researching and keeping your ears open to modern technology and making sure that you're adapting every kind of technology to make the work and culture as strong as it possibly can do. And I also think probably the other biggest change will be, and I can use my own experience. I've got 3 daughters who are 2, 4, and 6 years old. I know that lockdown for us was a very interesting blend of me working before they were, before their school days were starting, then having breakfast with them, and then going back to work and having a longer lunch with them. And then my working day was definitely spread out through all the hours of the day. And I think that what businesses is going to look like in the future is that the reality is businesses will look beyond hours worked, way more now to things produced, and way more towards what the end result is, as opposed to when and where you're doing that. I think the adaptation of that for every business is going to be a really positive step, because I think it will finally allow people to get what feels like the right work-life balance, where that's been a phrase that's been around for a long time. But I think the reality is one of the few good things that will come out of COVID is that the right businesses should be able to adapt to that as a positive thing moving forward.
Yeah, let's hope so. It's high time for this to happen, definitely. And what about automation? Are jobs going to be to get automated, and what's going to happen to? For sure, we know already that some jobs are going to get automated, and people will lose their jobs. So, what do you think is the future when it comes to artificial intelligence and technology generally?
It's a really interesting area, Aga, because I think the reality is there's a lot of people that will be affected by potential automation. Fundamentally, from what we see with all of the clients that we work with, and as much as we can make sure that the right people are getting into the right roles, there is an element at a certain level of professional services industries and technology businesses, life science businesses, where they want to make sure that the person that is going into a prospective position is maintains and shares a kind of similar values and a similar vision for how business should be conducted. And I don't think, or I don't see a way at the moment that automation is going to be able to surpass the very, very important human element at a certain level and seniority of jobs. It might be a case that there will be more and more automation brought into a certain type of role or a certain type of a position. But I certainly think that where people buy from people. People want to feel and want to know what person they're kind of, that they're working alongside and working hard with. And therefore, I think from a certain level of professionalism and up, I don't think that automation will have as big an effect in the immediate future as some may be predicting.
What are the most important human skills, would you say, that cannot be replaced or automated?
I think that empathy is a pretty important one. I think being able to understand people have very different and very complex lives, and having people that a level of understanding, a level of empathy, a sense of humour, and all these different approaches and personality traits. I think that what is really what makes the world go round. And I don't see an automation kind of service replacing that human instinct. To be honest with you, people like engaging. In your statement earlier, Aga, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a lot of people that have got pretty lonely, and it's been pretty sad to see so many stories in the press of people they've got good jobs and they're able to keep their jobs, which is great. But yeah, they're feeling pretty lonely because a Zoom conversation is not the same as seeing someone in the flesh and kind of sharing experiences in that way. So I would say that those human elements of kind of empathy and actually the human touches are things that are very unique.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Wonderful. Well, now is the time for the rapid fire question section. And so I'm going to ask you 5 questions in really rapid succession. And the idea is that you will try to answer them in under 2 minutes. Okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So ready?
Good. Yeah, good to go.
Okay, let's go. So how do you define organizational culture?
Organizational culture is people, purpose, and environment combined. I think an organizational culture sets the context for everything that the business stands for, and it's really kind of defined by the shared values and ethos of everyone in the business, from the founders or the leadership team all the way down to the newest employee.
And what would you say are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
I think, as I've shared already, but what do your staff think about your culture? How regularly do you ask them? How regularly do surveys go out and reach out to employees will be a great measure of where things are, and that will give some interesting indicators of a culture that's strong, or maybe a culture that needs some work. And I also think I mentioned to it before, but having worked in a lot of places over the years, I think being able to see how people interact with each other each day. So they have that kind of tribe mentality that you get a sense that they're fighting and working hard for each other. Is there a strong identity and atmosphere in a business and on a particular workspace? Or is it an environment where it's all kind of unfriendly competition, people are squabbling, there's a lack of direction, there's a lack of that good feeling in the air, which is one of those indescribable qualities, but you know it when you walk into it. So, I think on that side, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are the companies that you admire for their culture, if any?
Yeah, one of the most recent books I've read was Stephen Schwartzman's What It Takes, obviously the kind of founder of Blackstone, which is just such an interesting take on how to ensure that excellence is maintained with hiring and growing at as a sizable scale. And that's really interesting. But I think to give a slightly off-page answer to that, Aga, $1 Trillion Coach is a book in the mindset of Bill Campbell. He worked with multiple, mostly kind of Silicon Valley type organizations. And I think the thing that really struck me with that wasn't that there was one standout organization where it made me think, well, that sounds like a brilliant culture. But it's how Bill, with whatever the environment was, it was a human-based approach that he adopted. It was the fact that human beings are that unique quality that exists in every organization, and that way too many businesses go straight to business, go straight to the numbers or whatever it may be, and almost ignore the human aspect to what makes the world tick every day. So I think that approach in terms of a mindset is a great one from a cultural perspective.
Yeah. Absolutely. And thanks for those book recommendations as well. We're going to put them in the show notes. So finally, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I think the blank piece of paper mindset is a really, really good one. What do you like about where things are at the moment, and what do you not like, and where do you want to get to? And also that to understand where things are currently is to reach out to staff and to kind of get feedback from them on where things are currently, and that will really give you some strong indicators of where you can improve from this point on.
Mm-hmm. Love that. And so in closing, Peter, what are your final thoughts? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I think a lot of business owners are absolute perfectionists, but the one thing on culture that's been so evident during our last 9 years is that it's something that requires continual work and attention. It's never something that you're going to work on and all of a sudden it's solved. It's got to be a constant part of your process and your structure, and it's got to be something that you're striving to improve and get as good as you possibly can be continually.
Yeah, never ends. You cannot get there and say we're done. Fantastic. Are there any people that come to mind? If I asked you, who would you recommend as a great guest on the podcast?
I think she's our advisor to our board, and she was maybe the only woman on the FTSE 250 company when I was there, called S3. Natasha Clark. She's kind of one of the pioneers of the recruitment sector in the United Kingdom. She started as a trainee. She was with the business for over 25 years, and she was a board member as chief people officer for, I believe, the last kind of 10 or so years of that. She's got lots of experience. She's a phenomenal person to be able to learn off, and I think she'd be someone that from a much more experienced position than I would be able to give some really interesting insight into both women in the workplace, Aga, but as well as the kind of challenges that the current climate has given us all.
Thank you. That's a fabulous recommendation. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you so much for being our guest. It was delightful to be able to speak to you, and I've learned a lot. I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot. If people would like to learn more about your company or maybe some content that you put out there, what would be the best places online for them to check out?
I would say that LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out. I think the vast majority of people are on it. So yeah, LinkedIn would be the best medium.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks, Aga. It was really good talking to you.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, content editor.
Sound producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. I have to say, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to bringing you more successful CEOs from companies that have been doing well these days, because I think we all need a little bit of inspiration and some good ideas from those who have been successful in navigating the pandemic. So, before I give you a sneak peek into the next episode, here is a quick reminder of where you can download your guide to a company playbook. You basically just need to type this into your browser. bit.ly/culture playbook. That's one word, everything in lowercase. So once again, bit.ly/culture playbook. Okay, so this is going to be super exciting for all entrepreneurs and startups out there. In the next episode, my guest is going to be Ethan Mollick. He's an associate professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And what he does there is he studies and teaches innovation and entrepreneurship. His special emphasis is on how to give everyone more opportunities to be innovative and entrepreneurial. And his mission is basically to democratize entrepreneurship. He does that by championing an evidence-based revolution in the study of the field. He had a new book published. The title is The Unicorn's Shadow: Combating the Dangerous Myths That Hold Back Startups, Founders, and Investors. And in the book, he reveals the latest scientific findings, his own and his peers, on startups, and it's truly, truly fascinating. So for now, here is a sneak preview of our conversation.
If you look at the numbers for startups, you'll see that there are far fewer women than men who launch startups, that there are racial biases in startups, that there's all sorts of things that hold people back because they don't see themselves as founders. And that hurts not just them because they're not launching a startup company they could, but also society because we get a lot less interesting and diverse startups than we would before. So I think the biggest myths to me are the ones about who should start a company, because those are what's stopping people from even getting going.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.